61 species voted to erase humanity. And Miri Ostland finished her Sudoku. That is the sentence I have spent 200 years learning to say without my skin going pale. I was 23 years old, a junior attaché in the Quol-Ari Diplomatic Corps, seated in the observer gallery of the Grand Convocation Chamber on the day the tally board completed its final cycle. And I have since given this testimony to 3 separate historical commissions, one in Species Ethics Tribunal, and a graduate seminar at the Quol-Ari Institute for Diplomatic Studies, whose students looked at me with the particular expression young people reserve for events so far outside their living experience that they cannot locate them on any emotional map they possess. I tell it the same way every time. I start with that sentence. I have found no better place to start. The Grand Convocation Chamber holds 412 delegations across 7 tiers of curved observation seating, arranged so that every delegation has an unobstructed sightline to the central floor below. The acoustics are designed for clarity. Every word spoken at the central table carries to every gallery without amplification, which means that the quality of silence in that room, when silence occurs, is a specific and total thing. On the day of the vote, the silence lasted 11 seconds between the final tally reading and the first sound of HFY exoskeletal plates shifting outward in their species display of collective affirmation. I counted. I was 23 years old and I was counting things because I did not know what else to do with my hands. The VOR at high delegation compressed into a tight cluster formation, their chitinous bodies interlocking at the shoulder joints the way they do when a vote has achieved the unanimity their culture treats as cosmically correct. The Selhari observers in Tier 4 had gone still in the particular way their species processes large institutional events, all 6 heads oriented toward the same point, which was the central floor, which was where the human delegation sat, which was where I was also looking, along with every other conscious being in that chamber. Mira Ostland was looking down. She was looking at a small tablet in her hands, and her right index finger was moving slowly across its surface, not frantically, not nervously, with the measured, deliberate pace of someone completing a task that requires attention but not urgency, the way you might finish a sentence in a letter you began before an interruption. The vote had concluded. 61 species had filed formal support for the HFY purist block's extinction motion. 40 opposed. The margin was not close, and the only human diplomat on the central floor of the Grand Convocation Chamber was moving her finger in small increments across a glass screen. I recorded the following in my attaché notes. Human diplomat appears to have accepted verdict. No resistance anticipated. Among my people, placing an instrument face down on a surface during formal proceedings carries a specific meaning. It is not a casual gesture. It signals withdrawal from the matter at hand, a declaration that one has said everything one intends to say and will not speak again on the subject. I had seen it done in chambers before, always from the side that had lost something irretrievable, and it carried in those instances a particular gravity, the weight of a door being closed from the inside. When Mira set the tablet face down on the table in front of her, I wrote 2 more words in my notes: withdrawal confirmed. I kept those notes. I have them still, in a preservation sleeve in the archive room of my residence. And I take them out sometimes and read them, not because they tell me anything I do not already know, but because I find it useful to remember the specific texture of my own ignorance. The words are in my handwriting. The conclusions are entirely wrong, and between those 2 facts lies, I have come to believe, most of what there is to understand about what happened in that chamber and in the years that preceded it. Her name was Mira Ostland. She was 41 years old. She had been completing that puzzle, one small deliberate number at a time, for the full 3 hours of the session. Would you have offered peace to the species that just voted to erase you? Because she did, and she had already won. 7 years before the vote, the tablet in Mira's hands had still been warm from her coat pocket the morning she walked into a government building in a northern coastal city on Earth and signed the document that 3 people in that building and no one else in the galaxy were permitted to know existed. The document was called the TRANCOMPACT. Its founding principle, as it appears in the recovered archive, reads as follows: build the weapon to end them. Build the document to save them. Mira wrote that line. She wrote it at a desk in a room with no windows, on a morning when the preliminary intelligence assessment of the HFY purist block's political trajectory had arrived and understood for what it was, which was a schedule, not a threat, a schedule. The block had been patient. They had been building their coalition for decades, filing procedural motions, accumulating treaty obligations from smaller species who needed something and were willing to trade their vote for it. And by the morning mirror, I wrote that line. The question was no longer whether the extinction vote would come but when, and the answer the intelligence suggested was sooner than anyone in the human diplomatic corps had previously believed. The TRANCOMPACT was not a military program. That was the element that the HFY come in structure, in their post-war analysis, returned repeatedly and could not satisfactorily explain. It was to programs running simultaneously in the same institutional body, funded from the same classified budget line, staffed by personnel who understood that both tracks were real and that the second track was not a contingency. It was the point. Mira's sidekick at the signing was a 20-year-old analyst named David Rye, in his first diplomatic posting, still at the stage of his career where classified briefings arrived with the quality of information he had previously associated only with fiction. He had been briefed on the military track in full. He had read the intelligence assessments, the operational timelines, the projected engagement scenarios, the capability analysis that had been 7 years in preparation and that represented, by every conventional measure, a serious and potentially decisive military architecture. He understood, intellectually, that humanity was building something designed to win a war. Then he opened the second set of files. The second set was thicker. "What's in these?" he asked. Mira looked up from the document she was reviewing long enough to answer him. "The charter," she said, "for the government we're going to build with the people we're about to fight." David looked at the files. He looked at her. A long pause followed, the kind that occurs when a person is attempting to locate a new piece of information in a framework that does not yet have a place for it. Then he asked whether they were going to order the same thing for dinner as they had the previous 4 evenings. They were. The Qual-Ari diplomatic record recovered from a compact transcript nearly 2 decades after the signing. As part of the historical review commissioned by the Insprecies Compact's founding council notes this exchange with the thoroughness my species brings to all documentation, including documentation of things we do not understand. The record observes that the dinner in question was a lentil preparation sorts from Miri Ostland's region of origin, ordered at the same hour across an unbroken sequence of 9 consecutive evenings during the compact's drafting phase. The record does not offer analysis of why 2 humans responsible for the most sensitive military and diplomatic operation in their species' history would maintain such consistency in their evening meal during the period in question. I have read the transcript a number of times. I have not resolved it. It may represent commitment to routine as a cognitive anchor under sustained pressure. It may represent something about human comfort that my species has never developed the correct framework to properly identify. It may simply be that the Lannels were good. I have learned, over the centuries, not to assume I know which. The TRRNCOACO's founding year was also the year Ellen Arostave arrived at her first posting in the HFY administrative zone, carrying credentials that identified her as a cultural attaché with a particular interest in ceremonial exchange programs. She was 34 years old. She was from Glasgow. She kept a small notebook in her left breast pocket for recording bird sightings, which her operational handler had flagged as a security risk on 3 separate occasions, and she had acknowledged the flag each time and continued keeping the notebook, because she had determined that the kind of person who pauses to note a bird in a checkpoint line is the kind of person security personnel dismiss before they finish the thought. And she was correct. Over 7 years, Ellen mapped the HFY military infrastructure in complete detail. She also mapped the civilian infrastructure. The civilian mapping was not part of her assignment. She had added it herself, without authorization, on the basis of a principle she later articulated in a debrief document that any plan designed to end a conflict needed to know not only what could be destroyed, but what needed to survive. Her military maps went into the first set of files. Her civilian maps went into the second. By the time the compact's architecture was complete, the second set contained more of her work than the first. Lyra Vance had been embedded among HFY civilian populations for 5 years when she sent the transmission that Mira later described, in a recovered personal note, as the one that changed the weight of everything. Lyra was 29 years old, from Dusan. Her cover had given her access to the residential zones of a mid-tier HFY administrative city, a position that generated intelligence of steady but unremarkable utility until the 5th year, when she sent a report whose operational content was standard and whose final line was not. The line appeared mid-document, without heading, without context, without follow-up elaboration. It read, "They are not monsters. They are afraid. No clarification was requested. Mira received the report, read to the end, and spent the following 30 minutes, according to the same personal note, looking at the war. Then she returned to the second set of files and made 3 additions to the Governance Charter's preamble section that had not been there before. The additions named the dead from both sides. Amara Singh was 37 years old. From Karachi. She had been the 3rd operative in the Compact's intelligence architecture, responsible for a network of contacts in the HFY secondary command tier that had taken for years to build, and that was, by the assessment of the Compact's own analysts, the single most productive intelligence source in the program's history. She was caught 5 years before the vote. The HFY detention record, which was later recovered and entered into the Insprecy's Compact archive as part of the war's formal accounting, shows that she was held in isolation from the date of her capture through the date of her release. It shows that she was offered reduced conditions in exchange for information on 8 separate occasions across those 5 years. It shows that she refused each time, without variation, without negotiation, and without recorded explanation. What the detention record does not show, because detention records do not track this, is that Amara Singh taught herself harmonica during those 5 years. She had no instrument. She had a ventilation wall with narrow grills, and she had time, as she worked note by note, by ear, in the dark, until she could produce a recognizable melody. The guard assigned to her corridor during the 3rd year of her detention later reported, in a post-war debrief, that he had heard music coming from her cell for the first several months and had assumed it was a malfunction in the ventilation system. It took him 3 months to identify the source. He reported this without editorial comment. The debrief officer recorded it without editorial comment. I have thought about it for 200 years without arriving at a comment that feels adequate. Her name is in the TRANCOMPAC's founding roster. She was not at the signing. These 3, alongside David and a network whose complete roster remains partially restricted even now, built the intelligence and operational foundation of what Mira described, in a classified briefing recovered from the Compact archive, as the most expensive argument for mercy in human history. The phrase was not rhetorical. The Compact's final account of your program cost personnel, infrastructure, years of peril and institutional labor. The specific human cost of operatives who gave years and in one case freedom was not a small number. Mira had authorized each line of expenditure with the understanding that all of it was in service of a document that she hoped, with a specificity that approached something like prayer, would never need to exist. The second set of files was not a contingency. It was not a fallback position nor an optimistic footnote to the military track. Among the Qual-Ari diplomatic tradition, peace infrastructure is constructed after the military situation resolves and the likely victor has been identified. This is considered prudent. You do not draft governance frameworks for a post-war world until you know which side will be shaping that world. The TRANCOMPAC's governance architecture had been in drafting for 7 years before the first military engagement occurred, at a point when humanity had no reliable evidence it would win, and its existence was premised not on the certainty of victory but on the belief that if you did not know what you were fighting toward, the fighting itself became the point. Amira had decided, in a room with no windows, on a morning when a schedule arrived disguised as an intelligence assessment, that she was not willing to let the fighting become the point. Among my people, this level of institutional preparation for an outcome not yet secured is called VLTHURI, a term with no clean translation, but which approximates to the practice of building a door before you have confirmed the room exists. It is not considered a virtue in Qual-Ari diplomatic culture. It is considered a category of hope so stubborn it borders on poor judgment. I did not know, on the day I sat in the observer gallery and wrote withdrawal confirmed in my attaché notes, that what I was actually watching was the longest VLTHURI project in the recorded history of any species. 3 months before the vote, the senior Qual-Ari diplomat assigned to the human delegation requested a private meeting with Mira Ostland. His name was Salad Th. He had served 67 years in the Qual-Ari diplomatic corps, a tenure long enough to have witnessed to previous extinction class votes proceed from motion to ratification to implementation, and he was not, either by temperament or by training, a person who alarmed others unnecessarily. He had seen both of the previous cases from inside the chamber. He had filed reports. He had recommended caution and restraint and continued engagement through appropriate channels, and in both cases the appropriate channels had continued until the condemned species no longer had representatives to send through them. He did not speak about those cases often. When he did, his luminescence went to a very specific shade that the Quol Ari Colores Vevic shade, still blue, the color of water at depth, the color our skin produces when we are holding something that cannot be put down and cannot be carried much longer. He sat across from Mira in a small conference room adjacent to the delegation suites, and he placed both of his hands flat on the surface of the table between them. Among my people, that gesture is the end of negotiation on a subject. It means I have said everything I am going to say on this matter, and I will not say more. Sela Th used it as an opening, which I later understood was his way of signaling that what followed was not argument. It was testimony. You are not the first species they have done this to, he said. The quality of his voice in that moment, which I know only from Mira's written account of the meeting, recovered from her personal archive, was described as level, not flat. Level, in the way a surface is level when something heavy has been placed on it, and it is not broken. Mira waited. I have observed to full cycles. Sela Th continued. The boat passes. The condemned species responds. The responses have always fallen into one of two categories: submission, which extends the timeline while arriving at the same destination, or aggression, which accelerates it. His hands remain flat on the table. Neither response changes the outcome. The council is patient. The bloc is patient. They have been doing this long enough to have contingency frameworks for both responses. A pause. I have not, in 67 years, seen a third category of response. There is one, Mira said. What happened to Sela Th's luminescence in that moment, according to his own account, which he gave me 30 years before his death, in the same careful, qualified language he brought to everything, was that it shifted to a frequency he did not have a name for. Not gold, which is curiosity. Not blue, which is distress. Something between them, or beneath them, that occurred when new information arrived that could not yet be filed in any existing category. He waited for her to explain. She did not explain. She looked back at the tablet in her hands and moved her finger across the screen. Sela Th sat with her for another 20 minutes. His hands remained flat on the table. He did not speak. She did not speak. At the end of 20 minutes, he rose, inclined his head in the Quol Ari manner of formal departure, and left the room. He told me, many years later, that he had walked out of that conference room convinced Mira Ostland was preparing her species to lose with dignity. That the single sentence, the silence that followed it, the careful attention she gave to whatever small task occupied her on the tablet, these were not the behaviors of someone who possessed a plan. These were the behaviors of someone who had made her peace with an outcome and was arranging her remaining time into units small enough to endure. He was wrong. He was wrong in precisely the way I was wrong when I wrote withdrawal confirmed in my notes 3 months later. And he was wrong for the same reason. We both watched her set things down and interpreted it as giving up. Neither of us had yet understood that for Mira Ostland, setting something down was never concession. It was how she indicated she was finished preparing. The tablet, on the day of the vote, held a completed Sudoku puzzle. I know this because the tablet is preserved in the founding archive of the Inspecies Compact, in a sealed case in the historical wing, and the completed puzzle is visible on its screen. 7 years of preparation, 3 operatives, 1 governance charter drafted before the war it was meant to end, 61 votes against. The final number filled into the grid at the moment the tally board completed its count. I did not know any of this when I sat in the gallery and watched her place it face down on the table. I thought she was done. She was. The military phase lasted 19 days. That number appears in every historical account of the conflict that followed the extinction vote, usually positioned as a demonstration of decisive capability, a data point meant to convey the scale of what humanity had built in the years the Galactic Council had spent ignoring them. 19 days. The Hrizvari purist bloc had been constructing its political coalition for decades, had assembled the procedural architecture of the extinction motion across 36 months of patient treaty-making and favor trading, and had operated from a foundational assumption that the species it was targeting lacked both the institutional capacity and the psychological coherence to mount a meaningful response. Their contingency modeling, recovered in the post-war analysis and entered into the compact archive without editorial comment, had prepared for 3 response scenarios, the shortest projected for months of sustained engagement before any decisive outcome could be reached. The intermediate projected 14 months, the longest projected 2 years, with escalating external involvement from allied species who would, the modeling assumed, be drawn into the conflict on the block's side once its political momentum became clear. 19 days. What the TRNCOMPACT's military track had built, over 7 years of classified and unbroken development, was not a large force by any conventional measure of galactic military capacity. Size had never been the design principle, because size requires the kind of sustained resource commitment that cannot be hidden, and the program's first requirement had been invisibility. The principle that governed the military architecture was precision, the identification of the specific 17 infrastructure nodes whose simultaneous disruption would render the HFY purest block's military coordination system non-functional without requiring the destruction of the civilian systems that Elena Rostova had spent 7 years mapping in a Rostova notebook she kept in her left breast pocket, next to the one she used for birds. 17 targets, each one selected not because its destruction would cause the most damage but because its removal would end the military dimension of the conflict while leaving intact everything that would need to exist afterward. The governance framework required a functioning society to govern. Elena had understood this before anyone gave her permission to act on it, which is why the civilian maps existed, which is why the second set of files was thicker. The operation executed in a single coordinated sequence, 19 days from initiation to conclusion. And when it was complete, the block's command structure had no functional capacity to continue operations and no intact chain of authority through which to organize a response. What remained was a silence of a very specific kind, not the silence of a force destroyed, but the silence of a force that had been, with surgical exactness, rendered unable to act while remaining, in every other institutional sense, present. Into that silence, Mira Ostlund sent a transmission. It was not a demand. It was not a set of conditions or a list of terms or a request for formal capitulation in any of the several formats that galactic diplomatic tradition provides for the conclusion of military conflicts. It was a meeting request, addressed to the HFY military commander by name, and it contained one additional line beyond the standard courtesies: "We have something to show you." The HFY commandeer, in their post-war institutional debrief, returned to that transmission 11 times across for separate sessions and could not produce a satisfactory analysis of what it had been designed to accomplish. They had prepared frameworks for every conventional category of post-conflict communication. An invitation phrased as a social courtesy did not appear in any of them. The commander who received it spent, according to the debrief record, 40 minutes reviewing it before issuing a response. His name was Ko Virak. Light exoskeletal plating darkened with age to the deep graphite of senior HFY authority. Plates compressed inward in the posture of a being who has processed decades of unwelcome information and developed, through long practice, the ability to receive more of it without external indication. He agreed to the meeting. He would say, in later testimony, that he agreed because the alternative was silence. And in his experience, silence from a victor meant preparation for something worse than what had already occurred. They arrived with 3 senior aides. Mira arrived alone. She set a glass of water on the table, drank half of it, then set it back and adjusted its position slightly, so it did not cover the corner of the tablet beside it. She opened the tablet. She turned it so Ko Virak could see the screen. The document displayed was 412 pages long, and its title, visible at the top of the first page in the standard typeface of formal galactic instruments, read Inspercy's Compact Founding Charter and Governance Framework. Ko Virak looked at the screen. His plates did not move. Among the HFY, stillness under unexpected information is not the absence of response. It is the response itself, a complete suspension of the external physical system while the internal one devotes its full capacity to processing what has arrived. Ko Virak's 3 aides shifted, plates compressing inward in the unconscious physical signature of beings in the presence of something their institutional training has not prepared them for. Ko Virak did not shift. He sat without movement for a duration that Mira recorded in her personal notes as approximately 40 seconds, which is, she observed without editorial comment, a considerable length of time to hold perfectly still when a person across the table is watching you read. The document was the Inspercy's Compact, all 412 pages. Mira had not prepared a summary, had not extracted the key provisions into a briefing document, had not produced an executive overview designed to make the essential points accessible to someone encountering the material for the first time. She had brought the full document because she had decided, at some point in the preceding 7 years, that the only honest way to present something of this magnitude was to present all of it, without reduction, and let the person across the table determine for themselves what it contained. KOV read the title. He read the first page. He read, based on the subsequent debrief record, Article 3, which established the Compact's founding principles, and Article 7, which established equal representational weighting for all founding signatories regardless of the military outcome of the conflict that preceded the signing, and the sentence that Mira had added to Article 7 in the 5th year of drafting. After she spent 30 minutes looking at a wall, the weight of a vote shall not reflect the weight of a weapon. He looked up from the screen. This is your terms of surrender, he said. In the HFY Declarative Register, sentences stated as facts carry more institutional authority than questions. To ask is to admit the presence of uncertainty, and uncertainty is a form of exposure. What KOV said was a verdict, delivered in the register his species uses for conclusions that have already been reached. No, Mir said. A pause. KOV's plates shifted a fractional outward movement so small that the aide seated closest to him later reported, in the debrief, being uncertain whether it had occurred. Explain, KOV said. Article 7. Mira said. Read it again. He read it again. The room held the quality of silence that the Grand Convocation Chamber had held on the day of the vote total. Designed, the specific silence of a space built so that nothing said within it is lost. One of KOV's aides had gone completely still in the HFY processing posture. The second aide's plates had compressed to their tightest configuration, the physical signal of sustained alert in the presence of information that may require immediate action. The third aide was reading over KOV's shoulder. Then KOV asked the question that appears, in some form, in every account of that meeting that has since been recorded. The question that the Quolari Institute for Diplomatic Studies uses as the central case study of its graduate seminar on the history of conflict resolution. The question that I have heard recited in chambers, in archives, in small rooms by scholars and students, and the occasional diplomat who encountered it for the first time and needed to say it aloud to confirm it was real. He asked why. Mira picked up the tablet from beside the glass of water. Her finger moved across its surface in the measured, deliberate way it had moved across the surface of the tablet in the Grand Convocation Chamber 3 weeks earlier, when 61 species had filed their votes and the tally board had completed its count. She made several small movements. Then she stopped. She set the tablet face down on the table. Mira completed the Sudoku puzzle in silence, and recognition collapsed across the assembly. Because someone has to stop first, she said, and we decided it would be us. KOV's plating went completely still. Not the stillness of processing, the stillness of a system that has received something it has no existing category for and is, for the first time in a long career of receiving difficult information, genuinely uncertain what to do next. His head lowered slowly, deliberately, the full downward movement that HFY produce when a recalibration of fundamental assumptions is underway and the process requires physical acknowledgement. It was not a bow. It was something without a name in either language, which I think is appropriate, because what was happening in that room also did not have a name in any language that had existed before it occurred. The signing took place 11 days later. In the days between KOV's question and the formal ceremony, the Compact's second set of files became, for the first time since their creation, a working document rather than a classified one. HFY legal scholars were given access to the governance architecture and invited to propose amendments to the sections governing their own representation. 3 amendments were accepted. 2 were incorporated with modifications, and 1 was set aside for the Compact's first formal council session, where it was raised again by the HFY delegation and adopted by a margin of 27-4. Alana Rostav's civilian infrastructure maps were transmitted to HFY urban administrators, so that the reconstruction framework could account for what actually existed rather than only for what the military operation had touched or spared. David Rye, 27 years old now and no longer visibly uncertain about whether the things he was being told were classified or simply unbelievable, coordinated the document transfer sessions with the precise, unhurried focus of someone who has spent 7 years preparing for a specific week of work and intends to execute it correctly. The preamble was read aloud at the signing ceremony by a senior Quolari archivist, which had been Salah Th's suggestion and which Mira accepted in a meeting that lasted, according to the recorded minutes, 4 minutes and contained no discussion. The preamble named the dead from both sides. The names from the HFY side had been compiled from Elena's civilian records, cross-referenced against the block's own administrative registers. which had been recovered intact because they had not been among the 17 targeted nodes. The names from the human side included 3 operatives listed without cover designations, under their actual names, in an official document, for the first time since the program had been classified 7 years earlier. Elena Rustave, Glasgow, 34 years old at the time of the program's founding. Lyra Vance, Tucson, 24 years old at the time of the program's founding. The line in her intelligence report, "They are not monsters. They are afraid," was not quoted in the preamble. It did not need to be. The preamble's 3rd paragraph, which Mira had written in the 5th year of drafting and had not changed once in the 2 years since, said something in different words that meant, when read carefully, the same thing. Amara Singh, Karachi, 32 years old at the time of the program's founding, caught in her 5th year of operation, held in isolation for 5 years, refused interrogation across 8 formal attempts and an unspecified number of informal ones, without recorded explanation and without variation. Released 14 days before the signing ceremony, in a prisoner exchange written into the compact's transitional provisions 2 years before her release was certain. Because Mira had written it into the document during the 6th year of drafting on the principle that if the document was going to exist, it was going to contain the things that needed to be true, regardless of whether those things were yet achievable. Amara Singh was not at the signing ceremony. She was in a medical facility in a city 3 hours away. The attending physician's report notes that she was physically stable, that she was oriented and communicative, and that she had made one request during her first full day in the facility. The report notes the request was fulfilled before the signing ceremony concluded. A harmonica was located and brought to her room. She had been teaching herself to play one, note by note, through the ventilation walls of her detention cell, for 5 years. The report does not say whether she played it that day. I have always assumed she did. I have also always known that assumption is mine to carry, not hers to explain. When Ko Virak's hand reached the signature line, it was not steady. His plates had settled into the neutral configuration of a being who has been still for a very long time and has arrived at a particular kind of equilibrium, not peace, not resolution, but the specific steadiness that comes from having decided something irreversible and being willing to live inside that decision. Nira placed her hand briefly over his, not over the pen, over his hand. He looked at her. She did not say anything. He signed. The Insprecies Compact was ratified that day by 31 founding signatories. 2 of them had voted for the extinction motion 11 weeks earlier and had, in the intervening period, read Article 7 and requested inclusion through the Compact's provisional membership channel, which Davin had established in the 4th year of drafting and which Mira had approved without comment. The Compact's Representational Council met for the first time 6 weeks after the signing. The Hrisvari delegation arrived 11 minutes before the scheduled opening. This is the part of the testimony that takes the graduate students the longest to sit with. Not the 19 days, not the second set of files, drafted before the war that would make them relevant. The part where the former enemy arrived early. I have watched students look at that fact from several angles, trying to find the one that makes it make sense within the frameworks they already possess. I do not help them find it. The frameworks they already possess are not the problem. They are simply not yet complete. I am 223 years old as I dictate this final portion of my testimony, seated at the writing desk in my residence in the Compact's administrative district, with both of my hands placed flat on the surface of the page in front of me, which is a gesture my people use to signal the end of all further argument on a matter. I am aware of the irony. The Insprecies Compact has governed the relations between 39 member species for centuries. Its founding document has been amended 6 times in total, in the sections governing membership eligibility, dispute resolution timelines, and the administrative procedures for the translation archive. Article 7 has not been amended once. The sentence Mira added in the 5th year, "The weight of a vote shall not reflect the weight of a weapon," has been cited in 417 formal disputes across 2 centuries of operation, and it has been cited correctly in all 417 of them, which is not a record that can be claimed for many sentences written by any being in any language in the history of this region of the galaxy. Selachi H. died 40 years after the signing. He left me a letter. It was not long. Its entire content was as follows: I was wrong about the tablet. I have thought about what that means for 60 years and I have not finished thinking about it. He had placed both of his hands flat on the page when he signed it. The impression of his palms is still visible in the paper. Faint and permanent. The way a thing becomes when it has been held in one position long enough for the material to remember. I placed both of my hands flat on the letter when I finished reading it. I kept it in a preservation sleeve in my archive room, and I have not spoken of it, or of the tablet, to any living person from that day until the day I began dictating this testimony, which was 3 weeks ago, when the Historical Commission's 7th request arrived and I decided that the Commission was correct. The record should contain a first-hand account before there are no first-hand accounts left to give. The tablet is in the founding archive of the Insprecies Compact, in the historical wing, in a sealed preservation case at the center of the entrance hall, elevated on a plinth of pale quarry stone so that it is at eye level for most of the species who visit. The completed Sudoku puzzle is displayed on its screen. The archive has maintained the display charge for 200 years through twice-annual servicing of the power cell by a specialist technician, and the Compact's Facilities Committee has, into centuries of budget reviews, never once proposed discontinuing the service. I find this, in my advanced age, to be one of the more quietly consequential institutional decisions I have witnessed, because it means that the thing Mira was doing in the Grand Convocation Chamber when I wrote withdrawal confirmed in my attaché notes has been visible continuously to every person who has walked through the archive's entrance hall for 200 years, and none of them have understood it correctly. And yet the Compact maintains the charge, and the screen holds its light, and the numbers remain exactly as she left them. Visitors ask about it. They ask often, and they ask with the particular urgency of people who sense they are standing in front of something that means more than what they can see. They ask whether the numbers encode something, whether the grid is a cipher, whether the completed puzzle contains a message that Mira intended for someone specific. The archivists give the factual answer. It is the last Sudoku puzzle she finished, completed in the Grand Convocation Chamber at the moment the extinction vote concluded, on the day the Compact's founding day commemorates. The archivists answer correctly. They do not answer fully, because the full answer requires having been 23 years old in an observer gallery, watching a woman set a tablet face down on a table, and believing with total and documented certainty that you understood the meaning of what you saw. I believed she was done. The tablet rests in its case beneath the pale light of the archive hall. The numbers on the screen are finished and still. Beyond the hall's eastern window, on a clear morning, the Compact's council chambers are visible across the plaza, where 39 species are gathering today for a session on shared resource governance, arriving on time, some of them early, to do the work of an institution that was written before the war that made it possible and that has continued, without interruption, for 200 years. My hands are flat on this page. The light through the window is the particular pale gold of early morning, which is the color my skin goes when I am trying to understand something I have been trying to understand for a very long time. I have not finished.